of announcements. Chicago Bears, Patrick McCaskey and WSFI Catholic Radio are having an event which I noticed it doesn't actually have a name, so I don't know what else to call it. It's a banquet. But it's a banquet, and among other things, they're going to be honoring Cardinal Burke, giving him the Fulton J. Sheen Award on that night. And we've listed that on our calendar. That's another thing, by the way. Our calendar has what we call allied events. On the opening page of our website, we do our luncheon speakers, but then if you go into the calendar, you'll see other organizations. We've been trying to post about the rosary rallies, for example, down at Holy Name, and this banquet and the like. So if you're involved with an organization that's having an event that's kind of consistent with our mission, feel free to contact us, and we can post it on the calendar. As I said in the publicity for this luncheon, with all the stuff going on, most recently the war in the Ukraine, it's very easy to lose sight of a lot of loose ends in the church. And one of the biggest loose ends, and this came back to mind when an article came out recently reporting that Bishop Gustavo Zanqueta in Argentina had been convicted of sexual abuse of seminarians, okay? And that brought to mind, and by the way, we had already scheduled our speaker at that time, so it was just a providential coincidence, if you call it that. But it reminded us that the sexual abuse scandal in the priesthood is far from resolved. There are still cases percolating. The full extent of the problem, in my view, in our view, has not yet been disclosed. And, you know, it's easy to lose track of this stuff. Even in this archdiocese, I remember I would remind people when Cardinal Cupich came in, he promised a report on the Case Huseis, which some believe was a pipeline for gay priests from South America. He promised that he was going to do an investigation and issue a report. He's never issued a report. I don't know if the investigation was ever done. But it's a huge open issue, even in this archdiocese. So that's what we do. And again, to keep track of this kind of stuff, visit our site, CatholicCitizens.org. I've also been asked, and I think it's perfectly appropriate to mark the death and make a few remarks about a very good friend of the organization and supporter, Tony Makis. Tony Makis. I know who this man is. I do not pretend to know him myself. Do any of you know who Tony was? Oh, yeah. Okay, well, oh yeah, that's exactly right, because if you knew him, that would be your response. What I'm going to do is just read a couple of excerpts from a piece that Joe Morris, by the way, is on our board of advisors, very good friend also of the organization, but he wrote a piece which I think really captures what we capture, the kinds of members that we have, the kinds of people that are involved with us. This is just a few of the remarks that Joe Morris wrote about Tony. Tony Makis was an active and caring citizen, deeply devoted to the cause of American liberty and a stalwart of the conservative movement in the Chicago area. He was a longtime member and supporter of organizations as varied as Catholic Citizens of Illinois, the Heartland Institute, Hillsdale College, the Lincoln Legal Foundation, Toward Tradition, and United Republican Fund of Illinois, to name a few. Tony was also an actor of considerable note, his career spanning decades and including appearances on stage, the cinematic screen, and television. Among the movies he appeared in, he appeared as the judge in The Untouchables, which brought home I have a brother who's he was an aspiring actor. He's moved on to other things, but he actually appeared in that movie as well, and so that was kind of interesting to see. In the Chicago theatrical scene, he was also known as a director. For example, he staged and directed the successful and long-running version of A Christmas Carol at the Goodman Theater, which my wife and I and our children attended pretty regularly for about 6 or 7 years. I was not aware that he was involved in that. A staunch Roman Catholic, he undertook many kinds of lay ministries, including voicing the Bible for recorded versions of Holy Scripture. At the same time, he was a man of wide friendship that knew no boundaries of religion, race, or class, and was deeply involved in the many interfaith activities, including a long and productive commitment to Jewish-Christian dialogue. Tony Marcus was a patriotic American who saw service as a soldier in the U.S. Army in combat in Korea. He believed deeply in the American experiment and the rule of law, and often spoke out in defense of democracy and individual liberty. Tony is survived by Mary Lou, by a son, Anthony Marcus Jr. of Valparaiso, Indiana, a daughter, Judy Marcus Hooper of Vancouver, Washington, and several grandchildren. And I just thought we'd perhaps say some quick prayers on behalf of Tony Marcus. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Eternal rest grant unto them, O Lord. May he rest in peace. Thank you. And now I'll invite Father Finelli to come up and lead us in a blessing.
Well, how about saying the Angelus first, huh? In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. The angel of the Lord declared unto Mary. One more time. The angel of the Lord declared unto Mary. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Behold, the handmaid of the Lord. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
And the Word made flesh. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Pray for us, O Holy Mother of God. Let us pray. Pour forth and beseech thee, O Lord, thy grace into our hearts, that we, through the incarnation of Christ thy Son, was made known by the message of an angel, made by his passion and cross, brought to glory of his resurrection. For the same Christ our Lord. Amen. In the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Let us pray. Lord, we come to your holy, next week we come to your holy week. We want to follow you in your passion, death, and resurrection. We thank you very much, Lord, for all you suffered for us. So much suffering that our little sufferings count nothing compared to yours. And so, Lord, we thank you and bless you, and we ask your special preparation for all these wonderful people here who have gathered to hear Father Sullivan. May God bless us always. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Somebody always has to remind me, bless us, O Lord, and these thy gifts which we are about to receive from thy bounty through Christ our Lord. Amen.
I think we're going to move on with our program. Please continue to finish your meal and enjoy your dessert, but I think we'll get started here. Before I go any further, I wanted to acknowledge once again, and I meant to do it at the outset of the program, but Joe Curry is our videographer back there, and he has done an absolutely fabulous job. I don't know how many of you have looked at the videos on our website. We're at Catholic Citizens TV on YouTube, and just want to introduce you to Joe Curry. And if you have an event or would like a video, I guess life stories or all kinds of stuff. I don't know. Well, I think you have I think your website is listed on our videos now, correct, Joe? So take a look. I watched his commercial the other day, and it was very impressive. Anyway, Joe Curry. As I mentioned earlier, our speaker, just coincidentally, is going to talk to us about a topic that's literally in the headlines again, and I think will continue to be in the headlines going into the future. Reverend Paul Sullins, do we call you Father or Reverend?
Father.
Okay. I only ask, Father is a former Episcopalian priest, and I would call him Father. But anyway, Father Sullins was a research associate professor in sociology at the Catholic University. Taught there for 20 years before retiring in 2015 to devote himself to full-time research. He's written 4 books, over 150 journal articles, book chapters, and research reports on issues of faith and culture, including, a list of very impressive journals. His work focuses on the application of quantitative methods to pose fresh theoretical questions or insights on questions of cultural import and faith-informed perspective. He's given dozens of keynote speakers, lectures, and presentations at scholarly and popular conferences in Europe and the United States. He's also a senior research associate at the Ruth Institute, which I believe is in Louisiana, is that correct? Serves on the board of the Society of Catholic Social Scientists and several other faith-related organizations. He's a former Episcopalian, as I mentioned. He's a married Catholic priest with, I don't even like to mention this, but I will, an interracial family of 3 children, 2 adopted. And I say that because I think race is just an incredibly discredited concept, and I don't think we should even be talking about people's race, but I get the point. And frankly, I think you had already been lined up, but he just came out with a publication that caught my eye. It's a little academic sounding, but it basically covers the extent to which, as I understand it, non-efficacious sexual orientation change efforts, even if it doesn't work, even if you're trying to treat your homosexuality or your transgenderism or whatever, even if it doesn't work, Father's study shows that it contrary to the popular claim right now, it does not hurt the people that go through that, or at least the evidence that it does is non-existent. So this is the kind of stuff that, and this research, by the way, is peer-reviewed. This is not just somebody off doing stuff. This is extremely rigorous research, and I think my impression is Father's extremely well regarded in his field. Not popular when he comes up with conclusions that don't fit the current narrative, but respected for the work he's doing. So please welcome Father Paul Sullins.
Thank you very much. I actually prefer just to be called Paul, but I understand people say, well, I want to be more respectful and so on. So you can call me any of the above. The word reverend, of course, is a form of indirect address. You say the reverend in indirect, and father would be a direct address. So I do want to say just 2 or 3 words of things that I may forget later. The first is that the topic today involves intimate matters of sexuality. I will be using terms and references that you may not want to use in every setting. I certainly would not use it in a church setting, for example. So I don't want to say that I'm going to apologize in advance, but I'm just going to give you notification in advance that due to the nature of the topic, I'll be talking in some of those ways, and also in ways that are not at all politically correct. And so if you're offended by any of that, God bless you. I hope you can deal with your offense, but I'm still going to do it anyway. And then it was already mentioned that I'm one of the church's few married Catholic priests, and I've been actually happily married for 37 years now. We have 3 children. On the flight coming here, I sat next to a couple that had just gotten engaged and were getting ready to get married in October, so we had some good conversation about those things. And so if I casually refer to my wife or children, please don't go, oh, how can you do that? But if you would like to know more about that, certainly I've published a book on married Catholic priests that you can get off of Amazon. It's called Keeping the Vow. And there are other YouTube videos. I was on the Journey Home program, if you know that. You can look up their archives and get the story about all that, or you can invite me to come back and we'll talk about married Catholic priests and our conversion journey. But the third thing I want to mention is my email address, because already several of you have asked for information about my research or topics related to that. So if you get ready to write, I'm going to give you that email address now, so in case I don't get to it later. But you can see my last name in front of you on the screen, which is not Sullivan, it's Sullins, S-U-L-L-I-N-S. I tell people it's like Mullins, only it starts with an S. And then if you put an @ sign after that, and then CUA, which is for Catholic University of America, .edu. That's my easiest to remember email address, sullins@cua.edu. You can send me any question that you have, and I'll do my best to try to answer that. If you want to get on the list to get releases of my latest research, you can certainly do that. I have 3 such lists. One has to do with clergy sex abuse. The other, which is not that active right now, actually I have maybe more than 3 such lists, but then one has to do with research on same-sex persons and families in general. Mostly children who grow up in same-sex families. So I publish on that from time to time, and then Kevin mentioned studies on conversion therapy, and those kind of debates that are going on. And then I have a whole set of research that I've done on abortion, post-abortion trauma and difficulties for women and for families. I'll be happy to send you any of that as it comes out. Just say, I want to get on this list, or I want your research review on, do you have anything on this? And I'll be happy to send it to you. But today I want to talk to you about the problem of clergy sex abuse in the Catholic Church. And I'm calling this good news, bad news, good news, and worse news. The bad news, you may remember, 4 years ago, we had the grand jury report of Pennsylvania, which kind of actually capped off a summer of revelations about clergy sex abuse that put that back again on the front burner for most Catholics in the United States. The GJR, which is what I'm going to call the Pennsylvania Grand Jury Report, told us of over 1,000 incidents of reported abuse that was perpetrated by over 271 priests over most of the last century and the beginning of this century, just in a few dioceses in Pennsylvania. The average number of victims was 3.5. They ranged from 1 to 37. A minority of the offenders accounted for over a third of the offense that was going on. And so I want you to see kind of the range of sex offenses. This is not true just for Catholic clergy, but across the board. When we have a body of offense, of victimization, there are a lot of offenders who will offend one person. But at the other end, there are a few offenders who have many, many victims. So in this case, you have 22%, which is less than 10% of the total offenders, accounted for a third of the total victimization. So it's not just a problem of sex abuse of clergy, it's a problem of serial, multiple sex abuse of clergy. And what we want to do is not just to eliminate all possible sex abuse in the priesthood or in any population, which may not be possible. What we want to do is to get those guys who are going to do it for years and years and decades and have many, many victims, We want to stop them, stop those offenders. And when you do that, you close down a disproportionate amount of the abuse. Now, under 5% of the abuse was fixated pedophilia. That is, adult on child abuse, the child defined as a victim under 8 years of age. This was in Pennsylvania. The numbers are very similar to what we heard in 2004. And so many of us had the experience, well, here we go again, around the block. We thought this was over with. We heard about it and we took steps to solve the problem, and here we are, we're hearing about it all over again. So in 2004, in the what's known as the John Jay Report, which looked at the incidence of sex abuse in the Catholic Church, you have 140 priests who are 3.3% of all offenders, who accounted for over a quarter of all the victims. Again, a few priests, a few offenders who account for a disproportionate amount of the offense. In the John Jay Report, 6% was fixated pedophilia. So I just mentioned this pedophilia statistic in passing to show you how it's not possible that we can talk about these persons as being priest pedophiles, which is the popular image. An image, by the way, that was popularized in the Catholic press in the 1980s in an earlier round of clergy sex abuse that most of us weren't even that aware of at the time. But the image of a priest pedophile, a priest being a pedophile, or being oriented to pedophilia, came out of that. But it's just not true. When you have only a small fraction, less than 1 in 20 of the offenses that went on fit that frame, it's just not pertinent, really, to talk about priest pedophiles as being kind of the center of the problem. So why do we keep circling back on this problem? Well, I want to talk about that in terms of the bad news, the good news, and the worse news. So just to preview this, the bad news I'm going to talk about is the sex abuse itself, which came and went in a wave that peaked in the middle of the 1980s. And I'm going to present to you strong evidence that that wave was correlated strongly with the growth of the presence of homosexual men in the Catholic priesthood. And so the idea that it's not related to homosexuality or homosexual priests is simply, as a matter of empirical fact, untrue. Now, you can interpret that in any way you want, but we had a wave of homosexual men being ordained, entering into the priesthood. We had a corresponding wave of the abuse of children, not just any children, male children. And so if you think, well, how could those two be related? It's not too hard for me to figure out how those two might be related. You have, Then the good news is that the wholesale ordination of homosexual men is something that came to a crashing halt shortly after the 1980s, diminished rapidly through the 1990s, early 2000s, and it's debatable how much it's happening today, but from my research, it's not happening much at all. So I'm going to present you the evidence on that. But the worst news is that we still have lots of homosexual men in the priesthood, but in the upper ranges of the hierarchy. And I'll show you how that can be. We've stopped ordaining homosexual men for the most part, but we still have lots among us, and that's the worst news. That leads to lots of other problems that we have. Okay, so let's run through this. Here are the distribution from 2018, the John Jay Report. Let me turn on my little magic pointer here. Okay, so here's from the my analysis of the John Jay Report. And here is my analysis of the GJR, the Pennsylvania Grand Jury Report, and here is the John Jay Report's analysis. And you can see that the two distributions are very similar to one another. You had a rise and a decline of sex abuse. And so here, about mid-1970s, they found that sex abuse peaked and then began to decline. A striking feature of abuse in the Catholic Church, as reported in both the John Jay Report and the Pennsylvania Grand Jury Report, is that the vast majority of the abuse was male-on-male abuse. Well, why is that significant? Because in just about any other trend of abuse that we know, sexual abuse of children or adolescents, it's the opposite. If you look at the National Crime Victimization Survey or the Uniform Crime Reports from the FBI, and you look at the trends of sex abuse, you find that most abusers are male and most victims are female. A small proportion, it's kind of the opposite. You have about 20% male, 8% female sex abuse in general. But in the Catholic Church, it was the opposite. So here, 81% of the victims reported in the John Jay Report were male. To me, this is a very strong presumption that we're not talking about an ordinary population of abusers who would be men who would be inclined, for the most part, to women as sexual objects. We're talking about, for the most part, men who are oriented toward men as sexual objects. Also, as I've already mentioned, all but 5% of the abuse involved victims over the age of 7. So it's 95% of the abuse. 82% of the victims over the age of 7 were male. So we're talking about pre-adolescent or adolescent males who are the victims. The serial offenders that I talked about, the ones who engage in multiple instances of abuse, and often many victims, over 91% of their victims were male. So these were men who sought out other men, younger men, in most cases, to abuse or to have sex with. So here I have a bar chart on the figures that I just gave you. In the clergy sex abuse nationwide, we have 80% female victims. In the Catholic Church, 81% male victims. So that's unusual. In public school abuse, it looks like the national abuse. The other institution that would be similar, I think, to the Catholic Church would be the Boy Scouts of America, where they also had high proportion of male victims. This looks to me like it's related to homosexual priests. Now, the John Jay Report disagreed with that, gave 2 reasons why the sex abuse could not be related to homosexual men in the priesthood. One was that the increase in homosexual men in the seminaries in the 1980s does not correspond to an increase in the number of boys that were being abused. You see the argument, they're saying, well, in the 1980s we had more homosexual men coming into the priesthood, but the height of the abuse was in the 1970s. By the time the homosexual men came in larger numbers into the priesthood, the abuse was already declining, all right? That's their argument. And then they have this other argument that says that even though the victims were male, the priest didn't recognize his identity as a homosexual. He didn't identify himself as homosexual, so it's wrong to say that these are homosexual persons. Now, these are appeals to matter of fact, right? And as a matter of fact, they're both emphatically false claims, despite what we may think about the intent of persons making such claims. The first was the abuse of boys related to the homosexual priests. They argued that it wasn't because there was this mismatch in the years, as I've already pointed out. I won't read that to you again, but there are a couple of problems with that claim. First is, they admit that the reports that they look at for the increase of homosexual men in the seminaries may not have reflected more homosexual men becoming priests. It may have reflected more men becoming priests who admitted that they were homosexual. Because we all know that beginning in the 1980s, there was increasing openness in American society, a lowering of intolerance, you might say, toward persons coming out or declaring themselves to be homosexual. And so all through American society, we had an apparent increase of persons identifying as homosexual in all the professions and all the areas of the country, which was probably not newly minted homosexual persons just appearing out of nowhere, but it was probably persons who had been in the closet and concealing their homosexuality and were now coming out of the closet. So that's one flaw that might exist in their reasoning. The second is that their own data show that the percent of male victims peaked in the 1980s, not the 1970s. So if you look up all the abuse incidents, you say, yeah, there is a peak in the 1970s, but you say, what of those incidents were male-on-male incidents? And you find that the percent male kept going up into the 1980s. That's from their data. Now, these are weak pushbacks, in my opinion, but they are pushbacks against them. The third problem, which is a very serious problem, is that their incidence data is highly retrospective. That means it looks back. This is true of sex abuse across the board in any setting, particularly males who have been abused. They don't, in a high proportion, wake up the next day and say, Mom, Dad, I was abused. Let's tell the priest, let's tell the church, They don't do that. Why not? Because they know they may not be believed, that these are persons with status and power, and they're going to be blamed, they're going to be in trouble. They don't want to hurt the person often that's doing it. And so being guys, they just swallow it and stuff it. And so for decades often they'll do that. In the typical case, the abuse in adolescence does not get reported by a male until he's sometimes in his 30s or sometimes even 40s. It relates a lot to the development of his own family formation and sexual relationships, and it's often the first inkling will be when his significant other will say, honey, why are you having such problems in our sexual life? And begin to go to therapy or look into that and realize that this has affected him in deep and powerful ways that he wasn't aware of. Now, this happens to all sex abuse victims. The typical retrospective gap for males reporting is about 30 years. It's a little less for females, and men tend to not report at a much higher rate than females. But this is exactly what you see in the incidence data presented by the John Jay researchers. And they completely ignored this fact. It's a well-known fact for people who study sex abuse. You have to account for this retrospective, the nature of the reports. And they didn't do that. They also didn't look at actual existing data on homosexual priests. They looked at news reports and other media traces, but they didn't actually look at the data. The fact is we have data on homosexual priests. A couple of very good surveys where priests are surveyed and they ask the question, what's your sexual orientation? Usually some modified version of the Kinsey scale, which ranges from completely homosexual to completely heterosexual on a number of different dimensions. And from that we can get a measure of the percent of men who tell us that they are homosexual. And then we can look back and see what year were they ordained and what year were they born, and we can get good trend data, what's called synthetic trend data, on the number of men who were ordained at any period of time who were homosexual or heterosexual. So for Catholic priests, I used a good random sample survey done by the Los Angeles Times. The Los Angeles Times had, back in the early 2000s, a robust well-regarded, excellent survey department. Did hundreds of surveys, national surveys on all kinds of issues. And one of the surveys, surveyed 471, so they had a lot of experience. They did 470 surveys before this one. Was a national survey of Catholic priests following the 2002 sex abuse crisis. And they sampled 5,000 priests nationwide, got 1,800 responses, and came up with a pretty credible body of data. Not perfect, but pretty credible. It's been used by Andrew Greeley in his book on priests, by the sociologist Dean Hoagie on a book that he wrote. I used it for a chapter in my book on married priests in 2015. So we do have actual good data on this. Here's how they measured sexual orientation. They say, here's the question. Some people think of themselves as heterosexual, others homosexual. Where do you stand? And they could answer a heterosexual orientation, somewhere in between, but more on the heterosexual side, in the middle, somewhere in between, but more on the homosexual side, homosexual orientation. So it conceives of sexual orientation as a spectrum or on a scale. And if we take those data and we overlay it over the priests who are ordained in each year, we get these results. And the bars here are the percent in any given group of years of newly ordained priests who were homosexual, who reported themselves that they were homosexual. And you can see that beginning in the 1950s, that percent began to grow. During the 1960s, it went up to 20%. So by the end of the 1960s, you have 1 in 5 Catholic priests who were ordained during that time identify themselves as homosexual. That held true pretty much through the 1970s, and then in the 1980s it shot up. The early 1980s, the first half of the 1980s was the high point. We might want to say the golden era, if you want to think that way, of ordaining homosexual priests in the United States. 1 in 3 homosexual priests ordained from 1980 to 1984, during those 5 years, were homosexual. The peak year was 1983. In that year, half of all Catholic priests ordained in the United States were homosexual. And then that began to decline through the end of the 1980s. And by the time you get to the 1990s, you're at 16%, which is what, 1 in 7, I think, something like that, men in that area were homosexual. So what we have on this evidence is a rise of accepting homosexual men into the priesthood, and then a beginning of a decline in that trend. If we lay that trend over the incidence of abuse, remember the earlier trend of the incidence of abuse, we had it going up and then coming down. We're here, now we have the incidence of homosexual priests going up and coming down. And if we overlay those two trends over one another, they have a 0.9 correlation between them. Well, that's a very high correlation. If you know correlation coefficients, they run, a positive correlation would run from 0 to 1. 1 would be the highest you ever get. I do a lot of social science, and usually in the social sciences, we don't get correlations much above 0.3 or 0.4. We consider that to be a pretty strong correlation. But here it's 0.9. It's almost a perfect correlation between the rise and then the decline of homosexual priests and the rise and then the decline of sex abuse over this period of time. And so if someone says, clergy sex abuse doesn't have anything to do with there being homosexual priests, it's due to something else, like, I don't know, clericalism, or like pedophilia, or something else, I'm here to tell you that as a matter of simple fact, it's not true. They either don't know what they're talking about or they're in denial of basic, clear evidence. Now, I haven't made any appeal to church teaching or to scripture or to theology so far in this presentation. This is not a claim that's based upon my own particular beliefs or tendencies in a religious way or my spirituality. It's a claim based on empirical evidence only. And it should be convincing to anyone who can look at the numbers and can look at one thing that goes along with another. Now, you can interpret this in a number of ways, and you're welcome to do so. But to say that they're not related, it simply is not true. Now, there's another factor that's pertinent here. Because the LA Times also asked a question about whether there was a homosexual subculture in seminary. We might today use the term homosexual network, but the term subculture was used. It was popularized in 2000 by a book by a retired seminary rector, Donald Cozzens, who talked about interconnecting friendship networks in seminaries of men who were homosexual, who became so dominant in some seminaries that heterosexual men felt kind of on the outside. And it was not a positive development in his estimation. And he alleged that this was happening in a number of seminaries in the day. So the LA Times asked about this, and here are the responses by year of ordination. And you can see a very similar trend to the trend for ordaining homosexual men. In the 1950s, the men ordained during that time, a very small proportion, 10 to 14%, allege or admit that there was a homosexual subculture. Then it starts to rise. By the time you get to the 1980s, over half of all the priests ordained say, yeah, there was a homosexual subculture, in an active kind of homosexual subculture in my seminary during that time. So again, let's look at the correlation between a homosexual subculture and the incidence of abuse. And there's an even stronger correlation between the seminary homosexual subcultures and the rise and decline of sex abuse. It's a 0.96 correlation. So these things are very closely associated with one another. Well, here I'm presenting some statistical regression models, and I'm not going to afflict you with too much detail on this, even though I would love to do so. But here you can see these are, you can think of as correlations that are controlled for other factors that might be true. For we have the homosexual priests and we have a seminary subculture. We say, well, what happens if you look at both of those together? Which is more powerful? Do they add to one another? So on and so forth. And the answer is they do tend to add to one another. If you look at the percent of male victims as one outcome, the correlation between that and homosexual priests is 0.98. You really can't get a stronger correlation. You have to say these are really the same trends that are going on here. If you look at the percent of male victims for multiple offenders, it's still a high correlation, not in the 0.9 range. The percent of male victims under age 8, that is pedophile victims, is lower, but still significant. If you just look at the number of male victims and homosexual priests, it's a very strong correlation. So I'm going to move on and not get too bogged down here on this. Now, a second John Jay report, Causes and Context, argued that as I said earlier, a person may not identify his identity as homosexual even though he's engaged in sexual abuse targeted at young males. Now, there's a kind of a lack of common basic logic in that argumentation, but that's the argument that they made. And so if we look at that as an empirical claim, I find that this is also simply not true. And here I cite 3 studies that actually looked at priests who were in treatment for sexual abuse. So these are identified offenders, and found that the majority of them reported that they were attracted to boys, males of the same sex, either adolescents or juveniles. Okay, I like this one particularly. Malone found that 32% of the pedophiles and 46% of ephebophiles self-identified as homosexual. Well, that's a very high rate of homosexual identification. How many homosexual men, by the way, are there in the U.S. population in general? Well, it depends on how you measure it, but it's under 2%. 1.6% is the most commonly cited percentage. So here you have a general population, 1.6% are homosexual, but in this offender population, from 32 to 46% are homosexual, many times the rate of the general population. So to say that somehow these guys are not identifying themselves as homosexual is simply not true. I like this one by McGlone because he teaches at Georgetown University, and he completely denies any connection between homosexuality and clergy sex abuse. But here it is in his own research. He finds that it is in fact true and strong. None of these studies were cited by the John Jay report or even acknowledged. So they make this claim, and they don't even look at the evidence that refutes it, which is right there in the scholarly literature, waiting for any dumb person like me to come along and find and say, no, that's not the case. So that's the rise and decline of clergy sex abuse. That's the bad news. Now, it looks like abuse has dropped to almost nothing after the year 2000 if you follow out these allegations. And many persons today, Catholic pundits and bishops, say, well, clergy sex abuse is a problem of the past. The Catholic Church is the safest place for children today because we've taken all these steps and we've solved the problem. And so it's gone away. Nothing to see here, folks. Let's move on. There's no more abuse. But I want to put the brakes on that argument. There's a real problem with making that claim. Let me see if I can explain this to you. Remember I talked earlier about the fact that most of the, well, let me go to this chart. Most of the abuse that's acknowledged is done so retrospectively. When we hear reports of abuse, we generally hear of abuse that occurred decades in the past. In this current year, not this current year, but in the audit report for the most recent year, which was just published, and so it's an audit report for 2020. It was delayed because of the pandemic, so we're a year behind. So in the year 2020, there were something like 4,200 reported allegations of clergy sex abuse. Going back decades, the peak of those it was in the late 1970s, early 1980s. So we're looking back, right? Well, what happens if you have a trend of reporting that is backward-looking by 30 years, and you say, well, let me go back to this. Look, it's disappeared here. And you say this in the year 2019, when this was made, 2018, right? How would you know how much abuse is happening today if you only look at reports of abuse that's happening today, if most of the abuse that's reported is retrospective by 30 years? Do you see the problem? The only way to know actually how much abuse is happening today would be to time travel 30 years into the future and see how much abuse is being reported then. Then you can compare that with the abuse that we know today that happened 30 years ago. You would get a stable trend. But to say, oh, it's disappeared today because we're not hearing about it today. Well, guess what? In the 1970s, we weren't hearing about abuse in the 1970s either, because it's not all, but mostly backward looking. So it's a real problem of measurement. And if you can just understand that, you understand how the mystification happens in people thinking that somehow we're past all this. So in order to get a more accurate picture, what I did was to look at the minority of allegations that were reported at the same time as the abuse or shortly after the abuse occurred. Because there is a pretty stable proportion of current year or in the past 3 years allegations. And if we look at that over time, we can get a more clear picture up to the present day. And that's what I do here. I'm looking at only current abuse allegations. Now the red bars are all of the allegations, and I'm reporting this by percent so we can compare the scales. And you see that that peaks in the 1970s, just like we saw in the John Jay report and in the GJR. But if you look at only currently reported abuse, how much happened in each year, you see that it has also peaked and declined, but the peak is a decade later. The peak is right at the time that we saw the peak of all those homosexual priests being ordained in the middle of the 1980s. So if we're comparing apples with apples or stable kinds of allegations, you can see that the peak matches. Well, we've already seen this by looking at those very large correlations. What I want to point out here is that while this goes down comparatively to almost zero, these bars do not. They go down to a much lower proportion, but it is still a significant proportion of abuse. So the good news is that abuse has declined. But the worst news is that it hasn't disappeared, like people have claimed. So here are alleged incidents of current abuse by year. And you can see that when I wrote this, it was 2018. So in the most recent 5-year period, we still had 50 incidents of sex abuse going on. Now that's less than a third as much as we had in the 1980s. So that's a good news, but it's worse news if we think that it's disappeared. Here are 3 different ways of measuring abuse and taking into account some other factors, if you want to get more complicated, which maybe you don't on this, on how to not miss the measurement of abuse. First is the percent distribution of total allegations, which is what the John Jay report does. You can see that in this century, we have 3.1% of the total body of allegations. But then if you look at them by contemporary allegations, okay, these would be allegations that were reported in the same year that the abuse occurred, you see that there's over 3 times as much abuse. And that's what I'm going to be presenting to you later on. That actually understates the propensity to abuse. And why is that? Because if we have the same amount of abuse today that we had 20 years ago or 30 years ago in the Catholic Church, we actually have more abuse per priest, because what we know is we have far fewer priests today than we had 20 or 30 years ago. Priests have been declining. Some people call it a priest shortage. I think that's an overstatement, but we have certainly far fewer priests today than we had in the 1980s. So even if we had the same amount of abuse, not less, we would still have more abuse per priest. The priests would be more prone to abuse today. So if you control for that, which I do in this third bar, you see that it goes up another 20 or 30%. Well, I'm not going to get into that complication in this right here. So just looking at contemporary allegations, you can see that it goes up and in fact is rising, has been rising since the middle of the aughts. Here's a close-up on this. So this is the bad news. It's still going on. Here's the distribution of post-1990 incidents of abuse that were reported in the last decade, since 2010, by the date that the abuse occurred. And you see the same trend. It goes down right after the turn of this century, and then it goes back up. Now, just for you, I did this analysis 3 years ago, so just for you, yesterday I updated it with 3 more years of data from the National Review Board audit reports on the incidence of abuse. And here is the chart you just looked at. And you can see that it tells us that from 1990 to 1994, there were 82 known incidents of sex abuse. But in the past 3 years, we've learned of 146 new, previously unreported incidents of abuse that occurred in this century. Well, this is actually right before this century. But that 82, nope, this 50 here goes up to 136 with new data. We've learned about that many more. If I'm doing this right, the 24 is now 87. The 27 incidents that we knew here in this period, we now with new data, we've learned of 46. Another 20 or so more. And this 68 now is 72. And here we didn't know about any. In here, we've had 80 incidents of abuse just since 2015. So what I'm trying to tell you is not that we have a rampant problem of abuse like we had in the 1980s, but we do have a problem, and it's growing. In fact, it's noted in the bishop's own audit report, where they talk about audit findings and concerns. And starting about 2015, you had a section in the report that started to detail problems, dioceses that were not cooperating with the audits, that were not implementing all of the programs that they had agreed to do under the charter. You have a section that starts in that year called complacency. And it talks about a wave of complacency at the top of the diocese. They don't want to say among the bishops. They just say at the top of the diocese. And so we begin to see in the reports that we're supposed to be paying attention to, the documentation of this wave of complacency that's beginning to occur about keeping children safe. Francisco Cesario, the then current chair of the National Review Board, says that the bishops must rededicate themselves each day to maintaining a level of vigilance that will not permit complacency to set in or result in a less precise and thorough implementation of the charter. Well, this is very polite, measured language, but what he's saying is we're taking our eye off the ball. We're beginning to lose our focus on keeping children safe. Since 2018, this has been documented each year. We have seen growing incidents of abuse. Now we see media reports of seminarians being abused, of misconduct that we had not seen a decade ago, rising. So far, I haven't seen a single media report or article on the rising incidence of sex abuse generally in the Catholic Church based on the data that we collect and that we report about this. Now, we do have cause for hope. One is that today, the typical victim of clergy sex abuse is not a young boy, it's a young girl. We have become more similar to the general population. But I don't know if you think of that as good news or bad news, I don't know, but it's a change. And so here, this is the percent of victims that were male in these trends from the audit reports and the John Jay reports. And as you can see, as I've already reported, 92% of the victims were male at the peak of the abuse in the 1980s. In the most recent period that I can measure, that's under 40% of the victims were male. We also have good news in that very little of the abuse is being perpetrated by newly ordained priests. And here I'm looking at the percent of abuse that was perpetrated by priests who have been ordained 10 years or fewer. And in the 1960s and in the, let me see, right. In the 1960s, it was about half and half male and female victims. In the 1980s and 1990s, you have 33% of the abuse of, I'm confusing myself here, right. Almost a quarter of the abuse that involved male victims was by men who had been ordained 10 years or less. But in the current era, you have no abuse involving male victims by men who had been ordained 10 years or less. So the male-on-male abuse does not seem to be a product of newly ordained priests. In fact, as far as I can tell, very few homosexual priests are being ordained. This is a estimate extending the data from the survey that I'm talking about earlier. And you have to make different assumptions about this. The highest estimate would be that in the present time, the percent of homosexual men that were being ordained. And you remember maybe at the end of the 1990s, that was 16.1%. And so that kept on growing, right? And then by the middle estimate, it grew a little bit. And by the low estimate, it would be only going from 16 to 17% of ordained. And that low estimate matches almost exactly the experience of homosexual priests being ordained since the early 2000s. So it appears to me that we're not ordaining any homosexual priests from these models. Now, I don't think we're not ordaining any homosexual priests, but we're not ordaining enough to move the needle on clergy sex abuse as a statistical trend. Oh, here I recopied that just so you would see that. So we had 16% here at the end of the 1990s. That trend would be, we would follow here. It hasn't gone up since that time. So what's the bad news or the worst news in all of this? It seems like we are now no longer ordaining homosexual men. The abuse is gone, but not all gone. The bad news is this. During the 1980s, we ordained lots and lots of homosexual priests. And since that time, we have declined dramatically in the number of priests that are being ordained. So what happens when you have lots and lots of men who are ordained in one period of time and then you begin to turn off the flow is something that's called population momentum. We have that huge bulge, if that's maybe not a good image, but it's a bulge of men who are ordained in the 1980s, and as they age in the priestly population, they actually come to occupy a higher proportion of the priest population over time. And so here, this is the red portion down here, are the percentage or the numbers of homosexual men in the population of American priests by age. And what you can see is that when you get to be about in the 60s and above, you have a pretty hefty proportion of men who are homosexual. Something up to above 20% of priests above this age reported that they were homosexual. So what today we have a concentrated group of homosexual men among the senior clergy in the United States. These would be the ones who run things, who are in charge of seminaries, religious orders, dioceses, and so on. They are older. Most of them are over the age of 65, and that constitutes a problem. I think that it helps me to understand a lot of the trends that we see happening. When we begin to scratch our heads and say, why don't our bishops seem to respond to the predation or the difficulty or the violation of our Catholic moral teachings that are evident in the acceptance of active homosexual behavior among our priests, we can begin to understand that these are men who have many friends who are homosexual, who may themselves be homosexual, who are in some ways more attuned to and confronted with homosexuality than persons in the general population, for sure. In confirmation of this, Frederick Martel, I guess I'd say an investigative reporter in France, published this book. It's a very questionable kind of evidence that he presents, but the thesis of this book is that the majority of prelates in the Vatican, senior prelates, are homosexual, and many of them are closeted homosexual, and that affects many of the policies and procedures that take place in the Vatican. Now, I can't attest to the credibility of this book, except that what Martel is saying about what is happening in the Vatican is very similar to what my research is showing is happening in the priesthood in the United States. And then we have the revelations that are going on to this day that Kevin alluded to in the introduction to this presentation, that we really can't escape. In 2018, we not only learned about the grand jury report, we also, a few weeks before that, learned about Cardinal McCarrick, who had engaged in sexual misconduct of various kinds, resigned from the College of Cardinals in 2018. But you know, that's not the end of the story. He was defrocked the next year in a church trial that found him guilty of sexually abusing minors. And then last year, was it, in 2021, or maybe late 2020, the Vatican published the McCarrick Report, which was designed to defend the actions of the Holy See in the McCarrick case, but had the effect of doing pretty much the opposite of that, raising a lot of questions about what these guys are thinking when they're dealing with this kind of a horrific violation of human persons in a sexual way. And, you know, if in fact you have a cadre of homosexual folks or who have lived their lives in company with homosexual folks who are writing that report, you can begin to understand why they might not be so horrified by that. And so it goes in some ways to confirm this thesis. And this is not something in the past. Just last month, McCarrick, now 91, finally faced his first criminal charges on this sex abuse, which he is alleged to have done. It's detailed in the McCarrick Report how he used this house, a beach house in New Jersey, to coerce or deceive seminarians to come and to sleep in his bed and to engage in homosexual sex of different kinds for a long time. So how could that go on for such a long time? Well, if you have all these homosexual men who are in positions of power in the church, it can go on. So the worst news is that we have a very corrupt senior hierarchy on this issue of homosexuality. They are compromised. It's not a problem of just a few bad apples. It's not a problem, I think, of trying to convince minds, because minds are pretty well set. Well, Kevin also referred to Zanchetta, who's been in the news a lot, this scandal Again, what stands out about this scandal is not so much the man's misbehavior, which is not too different than what we've heard before. He used his position to try to coerce or induce boys to give him homosexual favors. But what stands out is the weak and inconsistent response at the highest levels of the church, including Pope Francis himself, who has gone back and forth on sanctioning him or protecting him in this. So you begin to think, how are these men going to take any real efforts that are going to really affect this problem? It seems like we're going to be back here again, and we'll be hearing about these things again. Again, this is fresh out of the news. Just last month, Zanchetta was convicted in a civil trial of sexual abuse, and he's now serving, I think it's a 4+ year term in prison on that. So today we face a corrupt hierarchy that has many homosexual men in it. That's the worst news for us. As a consequence, the problems of homosexuality in the priesthood are downplayed and they're denied. I could give example after example. When I was doing this research just for you yesterday, I hope you appreciate it, on the new audit reports since 2018, I noticed that the 2019 report was commissioned by Monsignor Brian Bransfield, which we now know has been, I think, removed from the priesthood. I'm not sure if he's been laicized, but at least he's been removed from his episcopacy due to long-term sexual abuse and financial misconduct. Then the next year, it was approved by Monsignor Jeffrey Burrell, who just last summer was also resigned from that position for having engaged in serial sexual misconduct. So this is not something that's just in a corner here or somewhere. It seems to be pretty much all around us in our hierarchy. Now, I do want to comment, many senior prelates have attributed the sex abuse crisis to clericalism, including Pope Francis and including Cardinal Cupich. This claim, on the basis of the evidence just presented, ignores the strong association of the clergy sex abuse with homosexual clergy misbehavior. The simple truth is that the overwhelming preponderance of the victims were adolescent males. I don't know anything about clericalism which would induce a man to seek out males rather than females as objects of sexual desire. If someone can explain to me how clericalism does that, I might begin to believe that. I just think that's a red herring, as we would say. Dr. Fitzgibbon, Richard Fitzgibbon, is a Catholic psychiatrist, I think, who features prominently actually in the McCarrick report. It details efforts that he took to try to alert the hierarchy, and he was ignored and rebuffed in doing so. But his latest statements says that clericalism can never result in a psychological need in a priest for a sexual encounter with another male. Anyone who blames the abuse crisis on clericalism is part of the abuse crisis cover-up. I think that's probably pretty true. And then there's a statement that I came across from Father Federico Lombardi, the well-known Vatican spokesperson, who responded to Martel's claims, which I will admit are speculative and maybe questionable, but his response was this. He says, of course there are homosexuals in the church. It's obvious. There are even a few who are more obvious than the others. I think that's an attempt at humor there. But he says, but I refuse to read things that way and to believe that homosexuality is an explanatory factor. Can you imagine that? I refuse to believe it. Doesn't tell us why. He just refuses to believe it. It seems to me that this is the root problem, and it's a problem far worse than anything that Martel was alleging. Whether or not we have strong or weak evidence for the existence of a homosexual network among those in power in the church doesn't really matter if those at the top refuse to believe that homosexuality can be an explanatory factor. Well, what is the solution to all this? Well, I hope that in the Q&A we'll talk about some of the things we can do for a solution, but I'm going to leave you with this thought. It seems to me that we have a generation of a homosexualized group of priests. They are aging. And they eventually will age out of this population because they're not being replaced. The younger clergy that are being ordained, particularly here in the United States, are of a completely different order in terms of their commitment to the faith and in terms of their understanding of their own sexuality and many other ways. And so it seems to me that we are in some ways similar today in the Catholic Church in America to the children of Israel in the wilderness of Sinai after the Exodus, after being delivered from the slavery in Egypt. God was actually being merciful to a faithless generation. He's saying, you're not going to enter the promised land, but I'm going to let you wander around until the old ones die off and we finally get Joshua and Caleb and all those young faithful folk who are going to be ready for the next step to enter the promised land. So, of course, at my age, that may not be a lot of consolation, but it is a consolation. It tells us of one thing that God is doing. I think that's the world that we live in, for better or worse, here in the Catholic Church in the United States in 2022. I want to say that I've referred too vaguely to a lot of sources in this presentation. All of them are online and available for you to read, at least the ones that aren't behind a paywall. And you can find them on the Social Science Research Network. The initials are SSRN, and this is my link there. You can actually, if you just Google SSRN and my last name, it'll come up, and you can peruse through that and look through all of those researches. But if you want a copy of this presentation or any of my other research, I'll be happy to send it to you. There's the email again that I gave you at the beginning of the presentation. Thank you so much for your attention.
I just want to say, and I've said this after previous speakers, that this is an example of the quality of the speakers that we bring in, and we very much appreciate it. Thank you very much. I have a quick question, then I'm going to open the floor to questions. Your research obviously is focused on the U.S. to some extent, perhaps on the Vatican. What do you know of, if anything, and I don't want you to say you know anything if you don't know it, of the third world, for example? I mean, we have the impression, or at least it seems like, our priesthood in the third world perhaps is more solid than what we have in the United States. Are they doing similar research in other countries, or have you looked at that? Or
I'm not familiar with a lot of research on that part of the world, but it is true that there is a good deal of sexual misconduct that takes place in that part of the world. Most of the sexual misconduct that I read about in Africa and in South America and other what we would think of as third world places has to do with priests fathering children or entering into illicit sexual liaison. Some speculate that a high proportion of priests in South America, for example, are living in concubinage of one sort or another. But other than that, I don't know a lot about it.
Yes.
Thank you, Father. As always, these are very enlightening presentations. So,
Thank you.
A good number of years ago, I had occasion to visit a priest at the Dominican convent in Des Plaines. And when I went there with a colleague, the receptionist, young man, was in his mid-20s, wearing a pair of cut-off jeans slid up to his waist. Obviously, the object of someone's desire is what I would read. And the priest that we visited told us that the director of he was going to vet those who wanted to join this convent, this monastery, and he would ask them, do you have any problem with homosexuality? Because if you do, you won't feel very comfortable here. This is quite a while ago, but I wonder, is that an anomaly, in your opinion, from what your research, or is that something that happens frequently?
Yeah, good. Again, this is not something that I could tell by research. I mean, I haven't done a survey of all of the different seminaries. However, I have talked to a few seminary rectors, and what I hear from them today is something very different than that. In fact, in my diocese, talking to the seminary rectors or vocations directors that I know best, they engage in a screening which is pretty much the opposite of that, in which they will observe the young men or will engage in discussion with them to see if they have a normal, mature attraction to women. And if they don't, then they begin to have a conversation about that. If you're interested in exploring that idea further, I'd recommend a book. It's by Father Carter Griffin, who is I think he's now the rector of our diocesan seminary, John Paul II Seminary. And it's called the Spiritual Fatherhood of the Catholic Priest. What he argues in that book is that if a man is not attracted to women, it does not desire to enter into a sexual relationship with a woman to the extent that he has sexual aspirations at all, he's not qualified for priesthood. Because the gift and the charism of celibacy for the priest is based upon exchanging natural fatherhood for a spiritual fatherhood. And a man who isn't capable of entering into natural fatherhood, right? Entering into a natural marital relation with a woman is by that fact also impaired, at least in embodying the spiritual fatherhood that God calls each priest to express. Now, I may not be summarizing his point of view exactly, but that's the general idea. What's interesting about that idea is that is very, very similar to the theology of homosexual men in the priesthood that's articulated by Pope Francis. He has said very, very similar things. So Pope Francis will not declaim on whether or not it's morally relevant if a man is attracted to men or women. And he's notoriously tolerant and accepting of people of all kinds of homosexual, but he's very clear that a homosexual man has no place in the priesthood. And he has claimed that he has imposed or spoken to bishops about this and spoken to young men many times about this and said, God may have made you the way that he made you. He loves you the way you are, but the priesthood is not the place for you. So I just offer that idea. But other than that, I don't know.
Yes.
Would you do me a favor? Can I have a glass of water?
I was wondering if some of this might be related to a possibility where some of these young men taught in the priesthood that sex with men was less sinful than sex with women, and that might be how some men could fall into this behavior but believe they're heterosexual. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. And there are documents that were published during the 1980s, early 1990s by a number of religious orders, actually, that would lead you to believe that they didn't think that homosexual sex was that sinful. In fact, it was a gift from God to be celebrated, and it was not invidious, if that's the right word. So I do think that set of ideas it has had an effect. What has also had an effect, and has been well documented, is the misuse of the confessional in the abusive relationship between priests and victims, where the priest will engage in abusive behavior, and then we'll hear the confession of the victim, and will pronounce absolution, and both of them will leave that with the idea that whatever may have been wrong has now been forgiven, and also with the idea that they can never ever talk to anyone about what occurred because it has been shared in a Catholic confessional. Richard Seif wrote a number of books, and he details this horrible process in a couple of chapters, but also it's referred to in the McCarrick Report and in some of the other sets of allegations as a very, very serious corruption of the practice of the confessional. That practice actually goes back to the Middle Ages, where it was rampant at times throughout the church. If you've heard of the Spanish Inquisition, for example, most of the investigations of the Spanish Inquisition were not teachings of heresy, but they were corruptions of church practice. And about a third of the men who were judged or sanctioned by the Inquisition were men who had misused the confessional in order to get sexual favors from both men and women, but a high proportion of them from men.
Yes.
Kind of related to that is we obviously live in an extremely permissive culture, both in and outside the Catholic Church, with homosexuality as they look at it as its normal lifestyle. How does that relate to, in other words, if they're acting in consent, even within the Catholic Church,
Right.
they're not going to say it's abuse. Can you speak to that?
Well, they would today. There was a long time where there was a gap in canon law where I'm not sure I will say this exactly right, and if someone here knows better, please correct me, but if a priest coerced someone who was a minor, or that was considered a crime under canon law, but if it was an adult, it was not a crime. It was a moral failing, but couldn't be tried or punished as a crime. That has been repaired. And it's one of the good things that Pope Francis has done, to now make it a crime for, let's say, a seminary rector to have sex with a seminarian, right? Even though both are adults. So I'm not sure if that gets to the point question you're asking.
A little deeper, if nobody complains and there's no accusation, how do you even know it exists? I mean,
you wouldn't know that the behavior exists if no one's complaining. That's right. And so these priests in South America that live with closet wives or mistresses, no one's going to make an accusation, right? You need someone to take the stance to make an accusation. So that's another problem, right? Does that make that right? Of course not. It's a terrible moral violation, and it's a problem rampant in the church. Yeah, sure.
Maybe one more in the back. Yes.
So, my definition of a homosexual male would be someone who's attracted to another male, be that male an adult or a child, but I've been strongly criticized for this, and also seen it in the press as criticism, saying that homosexuals by definition cannot be attracted to prepubescent males. What is the truth behind that, or who's right?
Yeah, well, of course, all these definitions are slippery, aren't they? Sexual orientation we measure in 3 dimensions. The dimension of attraction, the dimension of behavior, and the dimension of identification. So it's who do you want to have sex with, who do you actually have sex with, and then what you call yourself. And these do not overlap. Of all the persons who manifest any one of those three dimensions, only a fourth of them manifest all three of them. So there are lots of men who want to have sex with other men, but who in fact have sex with women, or who identify as heterosexual but engage in homosexual conduct of different sorts. So it's all messy and over the map. The psychological terms of ephebophilia or pedophilia are attempts, I think, at well-intended professionals, clinicians, to try to define a population so that they can address the difficulties of that population. I don't think it's successful. I think that the best thing to talk about when we're talking about this kind of abuse is to talk about homosexual predation. That's what the term that the Pennsylvania grand jury report uses. It doesn't go into any psychological type definitions. It says that these were predators who coerced sex from victims, and the victims mostly male, so that's homosexual predation. If it was a female victim, that would be heterosexual predation. And I think if you go too far beyond that, I think you're trying to know things that you can't know. So thank you for the question. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know it's late, and I know we've gone over our usual time. Are you available afterwards?
Absolutely.
If you have questions still, just come and feel free to approach Father afterwards.
Or send me an email.
Or there you go. Be careful what you wish for. So anyway, thank you all for coming. I think this is, again, an example of the kind of presentations you can find at our luncheons. This is very typical. So if you've not done this before, come again. There's sheets on the table outside that you can give me your email address, and we can, typically our weekly newsletter features the upcoming speaker first. That'd be the first article in the newsletter, and then after that, other articles. So it's an easy way to be alerted to what's coming and get your reservation in and so forth. Well, I was going to ask, how many are you from St. Canchis, John Canchis? And that was because of the bulletin ad that we had?
Yeah, for me.
Okay. We're really working on trying to figure out where to reach our audience. I'm convinced this room could easily be filled overflowing if we reached our audience. I don't think there's so few of us out there that we can't increase our attendance substantially. So again, thank you for coming. Have a great week, and we'll see you next month, hopefully. Thank you.